The first light slipped through the curtains, painting thin gold lines across the faded wallpaper. All around her, the house seemed to breathe with the sighs of old wood and distant memories. The air carried the comforting scent of yesterday's rain, still clinging to the ivy outside her window. She woke not with an alarm, but with the hush of familiar silence, the soft tick of the clock beside her bed marking the steadiness of a dawn she'd seen for decades. Her hands followed old patterns, brushing back silvered hair, touching the warm mug she filled with water from the kettle, listening as it sang out in quiet bubbles. This was her rhythm, one step after another, gentle as the mornings when her husband used to rise just ahead of her, the aroma of dark roast coffee a silent greeting. Now it was only her, the house, the creaks, and the sighing pipes. In these early hours she often wandered the rooms barefoot, letting her fingertips trail across the backs of chairs, feeling for the outline of a book she once meant to finish or the faded photograph tucked into the kitchen mirror's longing edge. It was here, in these long and private moments, where her courage had grown quietly older with her. A strength that not even she noticed anymore, like the way she could lift old boxes on her own or sing out loud when nobody listened. Since her neighbors had slowly moved away or passed on, most days began in that soft hush, broken only by the piano's silent keys, under layers of dust, and the hum of the refrigerator that sounded like a loyal animal at her feet. Sometimes she wondered if anyone else remembered that morning light could look different in every season. She caught herself watching the clouds, waiting for their shapes to tell her something she had forgotten to ask. The house, sturdy with years but tender in its rattling bones, was all she required, or so she often whispered to herself. But somewhere deep, behind her steady rituals and the faded roses pressed in a jar on the windowsill, a gentle ache reminded her there were stories left unfinished, embers that sometimes glowed even in the calmest of dawns. And what if the next ring of the doorbell changed everything? The first sign was the strange sting in the air, a scent thick and unnerving, cutting through the comfort of morning routines. She opened her eyes at once, blinking into a haze she knew did not belong, a gray veil mobbing the gentle gold of dawn. The old house had creaked and settled so many times before, each sigh easy to forgive, but this time the uneasiness in her chest rose faster than her thoughts could gather. She sat up, heart thumping, and in that pause between breaths, the unmistakable sharp scent of burning wood invaded her senses. Yesterday's rain was gone now, replaced by something dry and urgent, something that made her throat prickle and her mind race. She turned her head and saw, not sunlight, but flickering orange shifting across the walls, painting her memories in an alarming, restless glow. In the living room, the fire crouched low, licking its way across the old rug, sending curls of smoke up around her father's battered armchair, the same one where she used to read letters out loud to her mother on quiet afternoons years ago. A soft, dry crackling filled the space between ticking seconds as she rose to her feet on unsteady legs. Her first instinct was to move toward the sound, to see how far the flames had traveled, but just opening her bedroom door brought a rush of new heat and a deeper, thicker smoke that made her eyes burn. For a moment she simply stood there, frozen by the strangeness of seeing her home, so familiar and safe, transformed into a place of danger in just a single breath. That subtle shift, a corner where wallpaper bubbled, the low sound like paper tearing, a frame on the mantel slicing through haze, felt both impossible and irrevocable. She clutched the end of her nightgown, as if it were armor, desperate for something to cling to. It struck her, suddenly, how each day had lulled her into believing she would keep waking to quiet, undisturbed rooms. The smoky air pressed close, the heat creeping along the floorboards, threatening to wipe away the trusted order of her mornings. And what if no one heard her? Not today. She stumbled down the hallway, the floorboards groaning beneath her hurried steps, bare feet sliding a little on a patch of soot already forming on the tile by the kitchen door. The air was thick and soupy, turning each breath into a struggle. She pressed a trembling hand over her mouth, her grandmother's old ring cool against her lip. The front door, always slightly stiff in its hinges, looked closer than ever, but the smoke near it was so dense it seemed alive, swirling in panicked, unpredictable currents. Coughing, she reached for the doorknob out of sheer habit, memory guiding her more than sight. It burned as she touched it, forcing her to jerk her hand away and bite down on a gasp. A memory flickered, her husband showing her how to check a hot door, the lesson seeming unnecessary back then, a piece of knowledge stashed away for a day she never thought would come. She pressed the back of her hand gently instead, just as he had taught her, feeling the intense warmth that told her escape in that direction was impossible. Behind her, furniture scraped and toppled with quickening flames, and she realized her home was shrinking, every room suddenly much smaller as the fire took up more and more space. She pivoted, blinded by bitter smoke, and stumbled toward the living room window, the very one she had washed last week, thinking of how sunlight would shine through. Its frame was hot and shifting, the glass already too clouded to see which way the world waited outside. She fumbled with the latch, but her fingers slipped. The swollen wood fought her, an old adversary now turned traitor. She wrapped her sleeve over her hand, tugged against the painted edge, but nothing gave way except a cough she couldn't hold back, rough and hollow. The smoke poured around her, seeping through every crack like an impatient intruder, and she pressed her forehead to the cool wall, just long enough to ground herself before trying again. Her mind spun through possibilities, grasping for another escape as her eyes stung and watered, her chest tight. And yet, even as panic swelled, a tiny voice rose to the surface. Hadn't she always found another way out, even in the darkest turns of her life? Heat pressed down on her shoulders like an unyielding hand, growing heavier with each passing moment. The air shimmered near the ceiling, blurring the edges of picture frames filled with faces from years ago. Sweat dripped down her neck, slicking the collar of her nightgown to her skin as she tried to shrink away from the hottest corner of the room. With every breath, her chest burned, the smoke clawing deeper, prickling the soft parts behind her eyes. The panic creeping up was quick and sharp, a pounding heart, the taste of fear as real as the taste of ash on her tongue. She could hear the flames hungrily chewing through old wood, the sound both familiar and monstrous, like a wild animal loose in her house. Her hands shook, her vision flickered. She could almost see her mother, years ago, urging her to stay calm during storms, to count slowly, to hold still and wait out the worst of it. But this was no ordinary danger. This heat could unravel everything in a breath. And yet, just as panic threatened to break her completely, another memory surfaced. She was 6 years old, hiding in a closet during her first real thunderstorm, clutching a little red flashlight and willing herself to breathe like her father had shown her. In, out, slow and steady, darling, like you're blowing on a dandelion. That old habit took charge now. Standing on shaking legs, she closed her eyes and inhaled as deeply as the smoke would allow, then slowly let it out, careful not to cough. Her hands pressed against her ribs, counting to 4, focusing not on the chaos, but on the rhythm of air moving in and out. For a few precious moments, the room grew clearer in her mind. The flames were still there, the heat still monstrous, but she found a small pool of calm that she could draw from. Even when her pulse raced and her world narrowed, she reminded herself, just breathe, slow, hold on. What else could anyone do, when the world is burning, except find the steadiness that lives between each breath? The memory came to her with the strange clarity only panic allows, a memory so old it wore the edges of another life. She remembered sitting on the stoop with her father long ago, the air sharp with autumn and wood smoke, drifting from someone else's chimney. He spoke softly, almost as if talking to himself, yet every word had settled in her bones. In a tight spot, it isn't strength that saves you, it's calm. The world can catch fire, but if your mind stays cool, you'll see a way out. She'd laughed then, too young to imagine what real danger meant, but carried his words into adulthood, using them like a silent spell during long nights as a young mother, and those first quiet mornings after her husband was gone. Her father had taught her how to tie knots, patch fences, and set a table for guests. But mostly, he had taught her it was possible to master fear, if only by pausing long enough to breathe. Now, as flames painted frantic shadows along the walls, she gripped that lesson tightly. She could almost feel her father's large hand on her shoulder, a ghost of reassurance urging her to look not at the whole room or at the relentless movement of the fire, but at the corner near the baseboard, where the smoke moved a little slower. One thing at a time, she remembered him saying, no wild leaps, no loud panics. As each thought threatened to break loose and spiral, she anchored herself with the memory of his voice, low and patient, guiding her through storms and heartbreak and the ordinary terrors of living. It surprised her how in the pressing heat and roaring uncertainty, the oldest wisdom seemed the simplest. Calm builds a bridge back to hope. And wasn't that advice still worth believing, even as her world now narrowed to each breath, each step? From somewhere outside, far beyond the smoke's grip and the trembling walls, she caught it, A faint, wavering siren, almost lost in the roar of flames and her own heartbeat. At first, the noise barely registered, fainter than the tick of the old kitchen clock, but then it grew, spiraling toward her in slow, steady waves. She strained to listen, holding perfectly still, tuning out the low thunder of burning wood and the sharp crack as something heavy surrendered to the heat in another room. Under the crescendoing pulse of sirens she heard voices, quick and certain, carried up the street by a breeze she could no longer feel. Hope flared in her chest, fragile but persistent, and for an instant she saw herself not as a woman trapped, but as someone found, her story reaching out like a hand in the dark. Tears stung her raw eyes, not just from the smoke, but from the astonishing relief that someone was coming for her. Yet, even as water welled, she forced herself to face the bitter truth. The fire had already claimed most of her house. The living room, once a haven for quiet mornings and Sunday tea, flickered with chaotic light. Flames curling around the sagging sofa, and the beloved piano she'd played after supper for years. With helpless clarity, she realized there would be no salvaging her favorite things, no time to mourn what was being lost. The smoke thickened, until it seemed the very air would crush her. But hope was louder than fear now, the sirens calling her back to the present, reminding her that help was close enough to believe in. A small sound, a dispatcher's muffled command, the weathered timber cracking, a distant voice calling, "We're coming," was all it took for her to steady her stance, brace herself, and reach again for survival. Wasn't this how hope always arrived? Not as a grand rescue, but as voices threading through chaos, holding a promise just believable enough to keep going. Despair tightened around her, cruel fingers pressing at her ribs as the heat grew hotter and the smoke pressed closer. It would have been so easy to close her eyes, let herself drift downward, as if lying back into sleep on a winter morning. Her legs trembled, wanting nothing more than to fold and let the world spin on without her in it. Flickers of old doubts lit up. What if she wasn't strong enough? What if nobody reached her in time? What if there was no air left? Each time she gulped for breath, the taste was bitter with fear. The fire's crackle filled every silence, making even the memory of her father's calm seem far away and unreal. The shrinking world around her, painted orange and gray, looked less and less like a home and more like a trap closing shut. But then, in the shivering hush between siren wails, one stubborn thought took root. She saw her own reflection, not in a real mirror, but in memory. Her younger self, chin lifted after a bad fall, a mouthful of determination even when her knees still bled. "Get up," that old, persistent voice urged. "There's still time." That small spark, the one that had seen her through heartbreak and hard years, flared in her mind, refusing to let her collapse. Through the haze, she remembered promises made to those she loved, to always try one more time, to stand when standing seemed impossible. Despair might have been the closer guest, but hope had always been the better host. So she wiped her eyes on her sleeve, found a steadier patch of floor, and blinked until she could see the outline of the hallway. Somewhere, there had to be a place left untouched by fire, a safe corner, or maybe just a chance. And isn't it true? Sometimes, a single insistent thought can pull us back from the edge when nothing else can. The fire rushed forward as if it had a will of its own. Tongues of orange racing across the floor, hungry and impatient, swallowing the old floral rug and climbing high against the faded drapes. Every corner of her house seemed to twist inward, the familiar shadows turning into wild, dancing shapes that leapt across walls and ceiling. There was no path left through the living room, not with the flames roaring and the thick, oily smoke rolling in waves across the furniture she had polished for years. Books fell from their shelves, pages curling in the heat, their stories lifting up in spirals of ash. It felt, for a heartbeat, as if the fire was determined to erase every trace of her life. Every memory hung carefully on those walls. Sweat slid down her back, mixing with the ash already streaked across her arms. The fire snapped and howled at her, mocking her slow steps and frantic eyes, forcing her to let go of the world she knew, one room at a time. With no way back, and the heat turning each breath into a private battle, she used the last of her resolve to search for some hidden pocket of space the flames hadn't found. Down the hallway, away from the inferno's worst hunger, she saw a narrow alcove between the linen closet and her bedroom door, a place where the smoke gathered but the flames had not yet reached. She pressed herself into that shelter, pulling her knees in, making her whole body as small as possible. The old plaster wall was cold against her face, a rare relief, and she let her cheek rest there for a moment, grounding herself in its steady chill. It wasn't much, but it was something, a pause in the destruction, a thin slice of safety that offered time, even if only a little. She pressed a hand to her heart, feeling its wild thumping, whispering promises she'd made again and again in other dark times, not to give up, not to close her eyes, not while one refuge remained. Isn't it in these tiniest corners, when all seems lost, that a person's courage shines brightest? Pressed in the small alcove, her knees hugged tight to her chest, the world shrank down to the cold touch of the wall and the menacing sound of fire eating through the home she had built piece by piece over a lifetime. Every muscle ached, every heartbeat seemed to count double, and a desperate need filled her, not for things, not even for memories, but simply for one more chance at life. Her breath rasped loud in her own ears, thick with smoke but steady. For a few seconds she squeezed her eyes shut, fighting back tears, letting the noises around her fade. Then, as if something within her woke up all at once, a force deeper than panic or fear coursed through her chest. "Not while I'm breathing," she shouted, or maybe just whispered, the sound fierce, cutting through the smoke and crash, echoing off old plaster and gathering in the troubled, trembling air. It was a promise, a threat, and a prayer rolled into one small moment that nobody else might hear. In the hush that followed her shout, something shifted, not in the fire, but in her. The room was still hungry and wild, the smoke still pressed tight, but that one line seemed to steady the world around her. It was a lived-in defiance, a refusal that felt as old as her own heartbeat, sparked by every time she had chosen to keep going when giving up would have hurt less. Maybe the flames hurt her, or maybe they didn't, but the words filled the alcove like a barrier, holding off despair. She pressed her palm to the cool floor, feeling its solidity, drawing strength from the weight of her own existence. Even as the fire's angry glow flickered brighter through the cracks, she sat up straighter, her breathing measured now, not by panic but by a fierce will that would not slip away quietly. Isn't it strange how sometimes a quiet vow spoken in the darkest hour can roar louder than any blaze? A surprising spark ignited in her chest, sudden as the breaking of dawn through storm clouds. She had thought herself spent, but the echo of her own words lingered in the air, as if the walls themselves had whispered back, reminding her that surrender was not part of her story. The alcove could shield her only so long. She took one trembling, determined breath, then another, feeling each inhale clear, a narrow path through the suffocating panic inside her. Slowly, she uncurled her legs and forced herself to stand, a motion that made her head spin and her knees threaten to buckle. Yet the force that carried her now was different. It felt like the same stubborn energy that had helped her build this life year after year, patching cracked plaster and learning to laugh again after loss. The fire hadn't won yet. She pressed her hand to the wall for balance, then stepped away from safety's thin shadow, moving blindly toward salvation she could not yet see. The house still roared, but her focus sharpened, every sense tuned for hope. Her mind remembered details: the phone on the kitchen wall, maybe still within reach, an exit she had once scolded herself for cluttering with old coats. Each footstep was a victory, one more beat in a rhythm meant for survival. Her lips moved, shaped by silent prayers and the firm kindness of her mother's voice, years gone but never erased. Keep going, find the light. She moved, not quickly, but with a determination born from her vow. Past the place where the curtains had fallen, where singed photo frames rattled on their hooks, she made her way toward what mattered now, a connection to the world outside. The taste of hope lingered metallic and real. She paused to cough, pressing a fist to her mouth, but did not stop. Sometimes, help waits just beyond the smoke, if only you gather the courage to seek it, one step after another. Isn't it strange, the way a fragile body can hold on to strength deeper than the fire itself? Her searching hands found the familiar cord along the kitchen wall, the old phone she sometimes cursed for being too outdated. Yet here it was, exactly where memory promised. For a moment, her trembling fingers slipped over the buttons, the numbers blurring through watery eyes. Flame-reflected light danced on the old tiles beneath her feet, flickering on the collection of magnets from forgotten road trips and birthdays. The receiver felt heavy, sticky with a film of ash, She pressed it to her ear, heart pounding so loud she feared it might drown out any hope of a connection. Static buzzed, then a sharp ring, and she bit back a cough, focusing everything on the miracle of the tone. For a second, fear welled again. What if they didn't answer? What if her voice wouldn't work? What if it was all too late? A click, and then a voice, steady, measured, asking her name and address, questions she answered with words that trembled but would not break. She forced herself to speak clearly, clutching the receiver, as if it alone connected her to the world outside the flames. Her message tumbled out not just her location but the fear, the urgency, all that she carried in her shaking breath. The dispatcher's calm, unwavering tone became her lifeline, anchoring her in the spinning chaos. "We're coming," the voice promised, and she nodded wordlessly, even knowing they could not see. She gave an extra detail: her favorite blue door, the old maple out front. Anything to help a rescuer find her, lost but fighting. When she finally hung up, her hands were damp and quivering, but she stood taller, the relief as sharp and real as the air she tried to breathe. She had done it. Sent her call like a flare into the wild, unkind night. Have you ever noticed how the sound of another person's calm can feel brighter than any sunrise? The minutes stretched, each one longer than the last, every sense straining for the sounds of rescue. She pressed herself close to the cool wall by the kitchen, the phone's receiver hanging loose, swinging like an old metronome marking a nervous rhythm. The house snapped and moaned as the fire pressed further, devouring its way through cabinets and the legs of the oak table, where birthdays and holidays had once gathered. Smoke licked at her cheeks, and the air was so thick that every breath felt like it might be her last, but she would not let go of hope. The dispatcher's steady promise lingered in her ears, and she clung to it, replaying the voice as if it were a mantra. "We're coming." Her hands trembled, but she kept them balled into fists, nails digging into her palms, just to remind herself she was still here, still able to feel. Fear could have undone her. In that endless waiting, when sirens still sounded far, when the creaking roof above her head threatened to give way, she was reminded how small a person could feel in the face of disaster. And yet, determination held her upright. She whispered her address to herself, again and again, a lifeline against the tides of panic that threatened to pull her under. Her gaze found a tiny scrap of blue sky through the grime of the window, a thin stripe between plumes of rolling smoke. She watched it like it might deliver the answer, let her know when help had arrived. When her knees weakened, she told herself to breathe. When her mind drifted toward surrender, she bit her lip and counted to 5. Isn't it strange how a single thread of resolve can be stronger than fear, binding the will to survive even as everything else falls away? With each breath, memory and disaster mingled in the air, smoke curled into her nostrils, sharp, sour, and full of warning. But beneath that, closer to her skin, lingered the faint trace of her favorite perfume, pressed into the fibers of her dress from long mornings, getting ready in the same bedroom for 20 years. It was a soft, floral note, stubbornly clinging to her despite the chaos. Every shift of her body stirred it again, and for a fleeting second, she was transported to quieter days, smoothing the dress over her knees before church, adjusting a brooch at her collar, or catching a compliment from her husband as she crossed the kitchen, coffee cup in hand. Now, the perfume and the smoke fought for space around her, neither one able to conquer the other, both a reminder of what she had been, and what threatened to remain. She realized, as she pressed the back of her hand to her mouth, that those small details, and not just the crash of falling timber, filled her with the sharpest ache. The fragrance made her loss real, in a way the flames could not, weaving comfort and heartache together, like two familiar threads. Even as ash settled on the blue cotton of her dress, still damp from the sweat and fear, a memory flashed of laughter in the garden, of roses blooming next to the wind chime that no longer sang. The smell tangled with the present, and made her bold, rooting her against the fire's claim. Though the world around her was in ruin, this subtle perfume clung to hope, the small, stubborn way that beauty survives even when nothing else does. Isn't it often these gentle details, the scent of home, the echo of an old habit, that keep a person from giving up, even as everything else slips away? A new sound broke through the choking stillness. The sharp, urgent wail of sirens, not far away now, and growing louder with every second. She leaned her head against the soot-stained wall, eyes squeezed shut, letting the steady rise and fall of the siren's cry saturate her hope. In her mind, she pictured the red trucks turning the corner, the tires spitting gravel at the curb, and the brave faces behind shiny helmets ready to take on the chaos she could only endure. Even as the air quivered with distant promise, the fire answered back in fury. The roar was no longer a gentle crackling but a deep, swelling growl, shaking the window panes and making the walls feel thinner, weaker. The flames leapt higher, rumbling like a wounded animal determined to keep its new territory. She wrapped her arms around herself, bracing against the storm of noise, sirens and fire, hope and ruin colliding inside what remained of her world. Every footstep of the firefighters on her porch, every hiss of water as it would strike flame, became something she willed into existence, heartbeat by heartbeat. The fire boomed and snarled, but there was an answering rhythm now, something orderly and calm out there, fighting back. She pressed her forehead to her knees, rocking gently in place, letting herself believe that the battle was not so one-sided anymore. The siren's nearness promised hands would soon be reaching for her, voices calling her name, a rescue turning from dream to reality. Isn't it extraordinary, even in disaster, how the sounds of help can slice through fear and make courage possible just a little longer? At last, through the banging of the wind and the gnawing hunger of the flames, she heard boots striking the front porch and voices overlapping in quick, clear commands. The steady hum of the fire engine's engine, the thud of heavy equipment being lifted from compartments, sounded almost like music, a steady, rhythmic answer to the wild, unpredictable roar inside her house. Through the smoke-blurred window, a flash of reflective yellow caught the dim light, the polished surfaces of helmets and coats, standing out against a world gone dull and gray. The leader moved first, his posture calm and his gestures practiced, assigning tasks with a voice that cut through chaos. There was humility in the way he moved, never rushing, the kind of careful determination only found in those who have seen fear and learned to walk slowly into it. Around him, his team opened hoses and axes, the quiet confidence of people who trusted one another with their lives and now, with hers. Inside, she listened for them, their footsteps pounding deliberately through smoke-filled halls, calling to each other with a language that was half words, half faith. The leader's calm presence seemed to seep right through the walls, settling into her chest like a promise. She was not alone anymore. For a moment she almost smiled, remembering stories she'd read as a child about heroes in shining armor, and realizing, strangely comforted, that the real thing looked nothing like fairy tales, but everything like this. Boots scuffed, gloved hands steady, small instructions spoken with care. There was something deeply reassuring about the way they moved, each action measured, not frantic. They weren't afraid. She let herself believe she could borrow just a bit of their steadiness, let it in like a breath of fresh air. Isn't it true how real courage, the quiet kind, offers more hope than any grand gesture could? The firefighter leading the team was not young, but it was clear to anyone watching that experience held him upright. Not just muscle or adrenaline. His helmet bore scuffs and a faded emblem, evidence of seasons past, countless fires fought, lives changed. With every step, he checked his footing, never moving faster than the team needed, steady as a heart's rhythm, even beneath the weight of duty and the spit of sparks. His eyes, sharp and gentle both, scanned the doorways and the curling, bitter smoke, locating the safest path one careful decision at a time. When he spoke, his voice was calm, heavy with authority but never cold. He barked out orders with just enough force, each word trimmed of panic. Check the back, watch the floor, maintain the line. Even the loudest words were smooth, shaped by routine and respect for everyone in the room, from crew to victim. What stood out was not just his control, but the deep well of compassion in each small pause. Before entering another room, he placed a gloved hand gently on one of his team's shoulders, a grounding touch, a shared breath. He measured every risk before urging anyone forward, his fingers tapping against the radio, as if counting unseen seconds. To her, listening from inside the haze and fear, his voice reached through the smoke like an anchor tossed in stormy waters, steadying her heart. His movements were almost a ritual, checking air supply, signaling silently as much as with words, eyes flicking to every possible threat, but never looking away from what mattered. Somehow, his presence made the wild din of the fire seem just a little less final, his steadiness a promise, stitched through every crack and shadow. Isn't it true? Sometimes the person you trust in your worst moment is the one who never lets their own fear show, even when theirs is just as real. On the porch, the team worked as one body, each movement purposeful, shaped by training and trust. The leader checked the door with the back of his gloved hand, nodding to confirm it was safe enough to force open. 2 firefighters stepped forward, axes ready, but paused at his gesture. No reckless rush, just calm, deliberate force as they wedged the door open, letting out a thick billow of greasy smoke. Their eyes narrowed against the sting, scanning the dim shapes inside for danger, for the precious outlines of a person waiting to be saved. The leader barked another order, short but precise, and a hose line was threaded inside, no wild sprays but controlled bursts aimed low, sweeping away the first hungry tongues of flame that reached the entryway. Their boots moved carefully, testing every floorboard and step. Nothing taken for granted in a house fighting back with heat and collapse. From where she crouched, barely visible in the murk, she heard their voices, a strong rope of hope thrown across the burning dark. The team announced their presence as they entered, not in shouts, but in steady tones, promising her that help had truly arrived. As one member advanced behind the shield of water, another swept the narrow hallway, calling her name with practiced patience, as if coaxing a child out from hiding. At their heart was caution, every action designed not just to fight the fire, but to bring every living soul out unharmed. The leader's calm guided them, insisting not on speed, but on care, a quiet reminder that every choice mattered. Every life weighed in each step and word. Even in the wildest flames, there was kindness in the way they moved, gentle gestures behind steel and leather, determined not to let harm come where it could be chased away. Isn't it remarkable how real heroism so often lies in the simple, careful acts, the deliberate patience to save life above all? As the steady voices of the firefighters filled the house, she found herself gathering the last of her strength, pushing aside fear to make her answer heard. She pressed her palms to the cool floor, lifted her head from the crook of her arm, and called out with as much steadiness as she could find. "Here! I'm here, in the hall!" The fire was still loud, the smoke still bit at her lungs, but her voice climbed over those obstacles, clear enough to be a beacon in the chaos. Each word seemed to echo down the corridor, bouncing off the cracked walls and stained wallpaper. Instantly, the firefighters' words changed direction, their boots moving with new purpose. She called again, quieter but with conviction, making sure each syllable carried through the din. Past the kitchen by the linen closet. Knowing their training, she trusted that even the smallest sound could lead them, like lighthouse beams through fog. With every call, her composure grew. Gone was the trembling that claimed her body before. Now, her voice became a line she offered for rescue to follow, a lifeline she refused to let snap, no matter how the fire raged nearby. She remembered her father teaching her the power of a steady tone, how calm speech mattered most when the world lost its balance. The firefighters' responses grew closer. She heard the scrape of gear, the soft, reassuring urgency in their shouts. Relief welled up as she realized they truly heard her, that her presence was not lost in the smoke or drowned out by fear. She nursed the clarity of her words, wrapping her will around each call, guiding her rescuers closer step by precious step. Isn't it powerful, the way a voice, steady and sure, even when breaking, can become the bridge between despair and hope? Through the blur of smoke and heat, a beam of light swept across her face, then paused as a firefighter knelt beside her. She heard her own shaky breath, the crackling and chaos all around, but in that moment, everything felt distant compared to the calm, gloved hand reaching for hers. Surprised, she looked up to see a steady gaze behind the shield of a helmet. No hero in shiny armor, just someone trained to bring comfort where the world had fallen apart. Without a word, his hand gripped hers gently, pressing reassurance into her skin, even through the layers of heat and grime. The contact cut through the fear's last hold, the simple act more powerful than any grand speech. She squeezed back, and it felt like all the loneliness and panic flowed out, replaced by something cool and certain. He didn't rush her. Time stretched in their shared silence, broken only by his slow count. 1, 2, 3. Ready? His other hand helped her steady her balance, shoulders squared as if to say, "I've got you now. You're safe, just hold on." In the depths of her exhaustion, she realized how rare it was to feel such care from a stranger, how necessary this kindness was between two people in the eye of a storm. The rough texture of his glove, layered atop her trembling fingers, felt less like rescue, and more like a promise, one that she would carry with her long after the flames faded. In that grip, dignity returned. Her strength was reflected back in the sure hands guiding her to stand and walk once more. Isn't there something quietly heroic in the simple act of holding on when someone needs it most, no matter how wild the world has become? With one strong arm supporting her, the firefighter guided her carefully past smoldering debris and broken memories scattered across the hall. As they reached a clearer spot, another member of the team, face hidden behind a foggy mask but movements sure and gentle, stepped forward with a wet blanket clutched in gloved hands. Without a word, the firefighter draped it over her shoulders. Cold seeped straight to her skin, chasing away the suffocating heat, the dampness somehow washing the panic from her bones. It was no grand gesture, not the kind sung about, but it filled her with a surprising sense of shelter, as if someone had taken the time to say, "You matter, you're safe, this isn't the end." The smoky air clung to her clothes, but the blanket's comfort lingered above all, a simple shield between her and the world on fire. She clutched the edges, pulling them close around herself, feeling as if she were anchoring her body to solid ground again after drifting too long in a storm. In the flurry of rescue, hoses spraying, radios crackling, boots pounding, the act of covering her was gentle and deliberate, almost out of place amid so much urgency. She looked up to exchange a swift, grateful glance with her rescuers, their eyes crinkling in small smiles behind their masks. The kindness of that gesture steadied her more than any urgent words could have, softening her trembling shoulders and slowing her wild heart. She remembered, almost with wonder, the way her mother used to wrap her after running in the rain, the warmth and care always making her feel whole. Isn't it remarkable how the smallest acts, like draping a blanket or offering a drink of water, can remind someone they are seen and worthy, no matter how dire the day? Little by little, the air began to change. The sharp taste of smoke grew softer as the team worked with silent, focused coordination. Hoses carved cool lines across the battered floor, knocking the angry edges from the fire's advance. Steam clouded the ceiling, mixing with the last stubborn fumes and turning the room from a haunted, roaring blur into something almost calm. The noise softened from chaos to a slow, steady rhythm, the dull hiss of water against embers, the breathing of firefighters as they checked each corner for hidden sparks. The woman felt herself breathing easier, every inhale less thick, the pain at the back of her throat slowly retreating. With every sweep of the rescue team, her world grew larger, each new patch of clear air offering space for hope to grow. She watched through the loose threads of the blanket as smoke curled upward, growing paler, surrendering its grip on the worn-out wallpaper and dust-caked shelves. A cool draft found its way through broken glass, letting the sharpness of the night air replace the strangling heat. The firefighters' movements remained purposeful, working as if every breath she could reclaim mattered most. Each face that turned her way brought a nod, a sign she was not forgotten in the noise and shadow. As the mist of steam and smoke lifted, she realized that the worst had passed. It would not be quick or easy, the mark of the fire would linger, but now, for the first time that day, she could see just beyond her own survival. Isn't it amazing how the determination of a few working together can loosen disaster's hold, one careful action at a time? Wrapped in the damp blanket, breath finally less ragged, she felt the ache of exhaustion settle in her bones. Yet even now, with the catastrophe shrinking around her, the world did not feel empty. As the last curls of smoke drifted up and out the broken window, something gentle floated back in with it. Memories, not sharp or painful but quiet as a lullaby. The cold pressed against her, grounding her in the present, but the weight of the blanket brought her mind to other times. A child hiding during thunderstorms, her mother's arms pulling her close, whispering that she was safe. She remembered other small rescues too. Her husband's coat around her shoulders on a cold evening, the hush of his laughter after a day spent planting in the garden, the way simple warmth often meant more than any promise. The mix of smoke and cool cloth wove those days together, each feeling as real as the next breath. She noticed, with a strange clarity, how even moments of loss could brush against the edges of comfort. The smell of burnt wood, mixed with old perfume, tangled into her hair and dress, reminded her not only of what was gone, but of all she still kept, somehow surviving, tucked behind her ribs. In the hush that followed the worst of the noise, she let memories slip through, the time she'd patched the roof and claimed a small victory, the evening spent making soup for a lonely neighbor, the memory of hands held in silence. The cold, damp blanket revived the simplest hope inside her, a proof that compassion still lived in the world, found in a glance, a gentle touch, a stranger's steady help. Between what she had lost and what she carried forward, she realized survival was not only about breath, but about remembering why she fought to keep breathing. Isn't it true that in moments of crisis, even the smallest memory of kindness or warmth can mean the difference between despair and strength? She sat wrapped in her cold blanket, the taste of ash still on her tongue, and watched the firefighters move with a focus that seemed almost otherworldly. They didn't shout or dash about with reckless speed. Instead, every action was measured. A quick glance here, a hand signal there, the steady pulse of water hissing against burning beams. They worked in pairs, backs to one another, trusting that each would watch what the other couldn't see. Sometimes, through the haze, she caught their eyes. Behind the masks, there was no panic, only quiet resolve. Their movements were not only about putting out flames, but about making her home, what was left of it, safe again. It was the discipline in their routines, the way they checked every hidden place for sparks, that made her feel a new kind of hope. She felt a deep gratitude swell up, unexpected, as she realized that what calmed her most was not flashy heroics, but the steady presence they brought with them. The team seemed to speak without words. A gentle tap on the shoulder, a firm nod before opening a door or lifting a fallen chair. When one paused to offer her a crumb of reassurance, a thumb up, a quick smile in the eyes, she knew she was not just a task, but a person worth every careful effort. She studied their discipline, the way gear was handed over, the constant checks on each other, the silent support running beneath their loud, purposeful work. It reminded her of her own life, how strength had often been quiet, made of routines and small acts that built up to endurance over time. Isn't it remarkable how courage, even when contained and understated, can shine brighter than any flame? Through the haze of settling smoke and the rhythm of purposeful motions, she found her eyes drawn once again to the leader. His calm had not faded. If anything, the gentleness of his movements grew as the danger lessened. With the fire more tame now, reduced to patches of hissing steam and low flickers, he made a simple gesture. He crouched next to a teammate, a hand resting firmly on their shoulder before giving a small, steady nod. It was not the kind of gesture most would notice, but its meaning was clear. The worst had passed, everyone remained safe. No need for words or display. A look exchanged, an unhurried motion, and the whole team seemed to let out a breath they had been holding since the first order. She understood then that true assurance does not shout. It's felt in the hush when danger calms, and in the trust shared silently between those who fight side by side. She found herself resting easier after that, the hard knot of worry in her stomach finally softening. The leader looked her way. Only for a second, eyes kind even behind his sooty visor. He did not wave or call out. He simply offered her his quiet certainty, as if to say, "You're safe now. We have you." That silent connection, a quiet nod from someone who has faced disaster and now promised her a return to ordinary life, felt more comforting than any oath. Around her, the team's work slowed, their steps caretaking rather than urgent. In that simple exchange, she felt herself welcomed back from the brink, reminded that sometimes what carries us through loss is not noise or glory, but the gentle proof of steadiness beside us. Have you ever noticed how sometimes the smallest gestures, a touch, a glance, a nod, carry more weight than anything said aloud? When the time came to leave, the team led her gently, step by careful step, through the path they'd made safe. The firefighter at her side didn't urge her to rush, but matched his pace to hers, steady and supportive. The floor was still warm beneath her feet, the air thick and humid, full of the memory of flames. She clutched the wet blanket around her, the scent of smoke clinging to her skin, but her spirit pressed forward, anchored by the quiet strength all around. As they passed what was left of her favorite lamp and the half-open door to the room where she used to read, her heart ached, and yet she felt strangely weightless. The world outside grew closer, every step away from danger, a silent celebration not of escape, but of survival and care. She followed the faint breeze, finally leaving the sharp orange and dancing shadows for the softer, battered light of early evening. Behind her, the house steamed and crackled, the heat of the fire not quite ready to let go. She stepped through the doorway, as if crossing into a story both new and impossibly old, flanked by her rescuer's calm presence. The touch of fresh, cool air surprised her, gift-like, honest, carrying promises of restoration. The firefighters shielded her from the collapsing debris and led her past their organized chaos, hoses snaking over the lawn, neighbors standing back, concerned yet comforted by the scene's orderliness. Her legs felt weak, but her spirit, the old, defiant part, rose up, determined to remember not just the fear, but the hands that had lifted her, the measured guidance, the refusal to abandon anyone to fire or despair. Isn't it true that sometimes, when the world is reduced to raw heat and need, hope walks quietly beside us, step for step, until the danger is only memory? Crossing the threshold, she was met by a rush of evening air, cool and clean against her skin. It startled her with its sharpness, almost painful after the thick cough of smoke that had filled her world for so long. She drew a long, unhurried breath, and for a brief, perfect moment, everything slipped away except the fresh taste in her lungs. The promise that life, simple and ordinary, was hers to feel again. The wind moved her hair gently, tugging at the corners of her blanket, and she found herself closing her eyes, letting her shoulders drop and loosen. It was only then, with the heat at her back and the calm beyond the fire, that she realized how much she had needed this. A full breath, a cleansing sigh. The sensation of being held by air that didn't hurt. In that quiet relief, she sensed something soft and brave gathering inside her, like green shoots rising where scorched earth had lain. Around her, the landscape of her street had changed. Shadows stretched across the grass, blue and long with the slow promise of night. The fire engine's lights flickered gently, their urgency now replaced by a steady presence. She could hear voices, some concerned, some simply amazed that anyone could walk from such a blaze, but what stayed with her was the simple hush, the delicate balance of sounds after chaos. Her lungs filled again, then emptied, then filled once more, her body remembering that life moved in cycles, that every ending could shape a beginning, if only given breath. She stepped into the open, wrapped in blanket and gratitude, and let the world welcome her back with its fresh, ordinary air. Don't we all hold our breath during life's trials, only realizing how badly we need to exhale once hope greets us again at the door? She scanned the small field of commotion, firefighters collecting tools, neighbors whispering in small, relieved clumps, the battered outline of her once familiar home, and then her gaze settled on those who had carried her safely through the flames. There was no need for grand words. Instead, she held each rescuer's eyes with her own, nodding slowly, letting her calm gratitude pass quietly between them. In her look, she hoped they found her whole story, days of courage built in silences, the old strength now strengthened by kindness, and a new hope flickering alongside the memory of fear. The world felt changed, as if the pulse beneath her skin was both softer and stronger, from knowing rescue could arrive in such patient, human form. The simple act of meeting another's eyes, of saying thank you without a sound, was more than enough. It struck her how powerful a humble gesture could be. The firefighter who squeezed her hand in return seemed to understand, offering a tired, gentle nod, the corners of his mouth hidden, but his respect clear. In that stillness, with sirens humming behind them and the sky shading toward twilight, something rose up inside her, a quiet sense that the future had not closed, no matter what the fire had claimed. She looked once more at the sky, the wounded house, and at the team who had brought her through the storm. She was full of thanks, not in the loud, overflowing way of celebrations, but in the soft, enduring kind reserved for those who have truly been helped. In the hush after disaster, hope did not shout or demand. It shone, steady and gentle, in every grateful connection made. Isn't it true that sometimes the simplest thanks, a look, a smile, an honest nod, is what lingers longest after we are saved? Standing just beyond the ring of hoses, with ashes still drifting gently on the wind, she let herself consider how easily life could shift. Even a stone-strong house, built with care and loved for decades, could be undone in a single morning, by a force no one could truly tame. She traced the lines of her own hands, remembering moments when she believed she was unbreakable, only to learn how quickly the world could test that belief. There was no shame in being small before nature's power. It was honest and deeply human to admit how vulnerable a person could feel when a storm, a fire, or grief knocks at the door. Oddly, in that recognition of fragility, she found a quiet sense of peace. Maybe strength wasn't about being untouched or unchanged, but about finding reason to hope and rebuild after the worst had passed. What outweighed that fear, she realized, was the invisible bond knitting people together when faced with loss. The firefighters, strangers hours ago, had stepped into her crisis without need for thanks or reward, simply because it was right. Neighbors shared blankets, or asked with gentle concern what she needed. The leader's quiet command and her own steady voice had woven a web of survival out of nothing more than trust and kindness. For the first time, she felt how solidarity was its own kind of shelter, built not from wood or stone, but from the small, compassionate acts that kept her upright. In the end, she knew, everyone was fragile, but together they formed something far stronger than the sum of their worries. Isn't it extraordinary how vulnerability can be met and even healed by solidarity, creating unexpected strength in the middle of life's fiercest trials? As the last wisps of smoke drifted into the darkening sky, the world settled softly around her. There was a hush that followed the chaos, a gentle silence, deep and restful, where the wild noise of fire slowly faded to a distant memory. The air felt cool and still, broken only by the rhythmic click of hoses being coiled and the quiet shuffle of boots on damp grass. Where moments before there was fear, now there was calm. Where the walls had crackled and roared, now there was only the faintest echo, like embers whispering their goodbye beneath a bed of ashes. She listened for the sound of damage, but found instead a peace stronger than any destruction, a sense that the house and all it sheltered had not just survived, but come through the trial tempered and changed. The silence stretched, a rare, precious pause that allowed her to notice the small things. The night breeze brushing against her cheek, the cooling of her skin beneath the damp blanket, the comforting sound of a firefighter murmuring a few soft words to his team. Each breath she took deepened her gratitude, filling her with the understanding that the quiet after disaster is not emptiness, but space made holy by what has been endured. The windows no longer glowed with threat. Instead, they wore the calm reflection of the moon, the peaceful aftermath after a storm. In that pause between what was lost and what could still be rebuilt, she let herself rest, knowing that sometimes silence is not the absence of life, but its truest, most tender form of music. Isn't it remarkable how, once the roaring ends, the quiet that follows can sound like a promise kept? As the calm settled in, the firefighters moved with a gentle care, gathering hoses and axes, rolling up their last lines of defense as if tucking away the end of a story. There was no rush in their movements now, only the quiet professionalism born from knowing the danger was behind them. The leader checked each piece of equipment, inspecting gear and wiping ash from his gloves with a patience that didn't hurry the moment or the memory. Boots left marks on the wet grass, and helmets glinted in the soft light, revealing faces tired but satisfied. Each firefighter helped the others, lifting, handing tools, sharing small nods of understanding that spoke of battles won and lessons remembered. Their trucks, with doors flung open and lights humming low, waited patiently, ready for the next story that might crackle across the night. From her place near the curb, she watched them load the last of their things, oxygen tanks stacked neatly, ropes gathered with the ease that comes from many rescues before. They moved with a practiced grace, each action saying, "We're ready for the next call." A few cast a last glance her way, silent farewells woven with encouragement, as if reminding her that help would always be near, for her and anyone else who might need it. Seeing this, she realized that the true strength of these men and women came not from what they conquered, but from their willingness to begin again, wherever they were needed most. Their work was never truly finished. After one fire, another call always waited, another door would open on a desperate plea for help. In the way their gear was packed and hands rested on each other's shoulders, she saw not just an end, but a readiness and hope carried forward into an uncertain world. Isn't it beautiful how quiet preparation for tomorrow's storm can be a promise, quietly kept, for everyone who watches and waits? She found herself turning over the memory of her own voice, still half disbelieving that a single shout could carve such a different path through a nightmare. "Not while I'm breathing." The words rang inside her, returning in waves even now that the danger had passed, as if they were a song she'd always known, but only just learned to sing. She didn't fully understand where that courage had come from, or why it had arrived at the very edge of giving up. But she felt, in the invisible weight of the night, that moment standing apart from the rest, both an island and a bridge, holding her steady when everything else had crumbled. Each time she remembered that instant, the world seemed to pause, letting her sense its quiet power. It was as if the universe had marked a place in the dark just for her, a reminder that the tiniest spark of will can make space for rescue, for hope, for the next morning. Even as the house cooled and the world moved on, hoses packed away, the hum of distant engines fading, she carried that cry with her. It didn't matter that no one else heard it with her ears, the echo would stay, woven into her very bones. Sometimes courage is less about knowing you will succeed than about refusing to fall silent, even when the world presses in on every side. Now the memory warmed her, just as much as any blanket or gentle word, becoming a quiet beacon she could carry forward. That one instant, bright and fierce, would remain untouched by loss, as eternal as the hope it created. Isn't it true that the moments we least expect, the ones born in desperation, often glow the longest inside our hearts? Later, as the quiet night settled in and cool air drifted through open windows, she sat quietly with the remains of her world. The home had changed shape. Flames had left their mark, but some things endured. The old clock on the mantel ticked softly, the same way it had for years, its faded numbers glowing in the dark. Each second chimed in the silence, steady as heartbeat, inviting memories to surface between the pauses. She let her eyes wander the room, shadows stretching differently now, corners deeper, but still home in ways that mattered. In that gentle hush, she could almost hear echoes of old laughter, the soft shuffle of slippers in the hallway, voices humming the day's end. As the clock's hands moved forward, she realized that time didn't erase what she loved, it simply layered it, reshaping pain into something she could live with. The present wrapped itself around the past, woven tight as a shawl drawn up on a cold night. She sat motionless, grateful for smaller details, the faint marks on the walls left by children's hands, the smell of laundry soap lingering above the sharp scent of smoke, the enduring click of the clock as each hour was claimed. These threads of old life anchored her, keeping her from drifting too far into what had been lost. Silence filled the space, wide yet welcoming, holding room for all she had been and all she might still become. She traced the clock's contours with her gaze, comforted by its persistence. The passing hours meant nothing and everything. They carried hardship, but also survival, resilience, and beginnings just out of sight. Isn't it beautiful how the past and present can dwell together, quietly turning grief into acceptance, one tick at a time? Sitting in the softened gloom, the steady ticking of the old clock conjured a memory she had carried for as long as she could remember, a private promise, whispered in quiet moments when no one else was listening. It wasn't a vow written down, but one she repeated after every hard season. Never give up, even when all seemed lost. As a young woman, she had leaned on those words through nights of loneliness, through grief that tightened her chest until the dawn. In every storm, she had reminded herself to stand, find a small anchor, and keep going. Sometimes that strength looked like laughter when tears were closer. Sometimes it was simply staying upright, washing dishes, or holding a hand when the world felt empty. The promise was never loud, but it grew strong through repetition, a whisper worn smooth like a stone in her pocket. Now, after the fire, that old resolve felt nearer than ever. She replayed the instant when her voice had refused defeat, the courage that had flared, not grand or perfect, but real. Even shattered routines, singed memories, and the echo of sirens could not erase what she'd quietly built inside all those years. The courage to carry on had become part of her bones, quietly shaping who she was day after day. She smiled slowly, realizing that survival was not about never feeling fear or being unbreakable. It was about trusting that the smallest spark, an intention, a look, or the stubborn echo of a promise, could keep a person moving forward. That vow, whispered in shadow and in silence, was the one thing no fire could consume. Isn't it remarkable how, as time passes, the strength we promise ourselves quietly becomes a story we live, even when no one else sees? As the day finally settled into evening, the sun paused low on the horizon, painting the sky in waves of soft orange and warm gold. She stepped outside, the air cool around her skin and tinged with the sweet, damp scent of renewal after the fire. Her house, though scarred, stood firm beneath the gentle glow, its windows catching the light and reflecting slivers of hope. The whole world seemed to hold its breath as pink streaks threaded the sky, balancing the memory of the day's storm with promises too subtle to name. She looked up, her heart softening. The sky's softened colors reminded her of every time she'd watched darkness lift above her, through heartbreak, loss, and now the fearless edge of survival. Each shade felt like a reassurance, whispering that beauty wasn't gone, only waiting to return, ready to bloom after the flames. In the hush that settled around sunset, she realized how much the world could change after being tested. The colors above her were not the untouched blue of a peaceful morning, but something richer, worn, weathered, vivid with proof of struggle and healing. As gold faded to indigo, she stood quietly, breathing in the coolness, letting each shade fill her with new courage. The sky did not erase the wounds, but wove them gently into a canvas of dusk, stronger for what had been suffered. She watched until the last streak of sunlight slipped below the trees, feeling in that moment not just relief, but the pulse of rebirth, the certain sense that beginnings always followed endings, and that she could walk onward, changed but unbroken. Isn't it true how dusk can become a promise, and how resistance, even quiet and small, can make us new? As dusk deepened, and the last traces of pink faded from the sky, she found herself standing near the blackened edge of her lawn, gazing at the ashes left behind by the fire. Bits of roof and timber lay in fragile piles, dusted in a soft gray that looked both ancient and strangely beautiful under the faint evening light. She bent down, reaching into the warmth that still lingered, and sifted a handful of ash between her fingers. It was impossible not to see what had been lost, the outlines of a life carefully built and tenderly kept. Yet, in the quiet space between regret and hope, she noticed something remarkable. Gentle wisps of smoke still rose, carrying the last glow of embers that refused to die away. There, in the heart of the ruin, lived a reminder that endings are never quite as final as they seem. She let her gaze travel over the broken ground, imagining new roots reaching down, new sprouts waiting just below the surface. Where others might see only destruction, she traced the possibility of something starting again. An old daffodil bulb buried deep, a memory ready to shine brighter because it had survived. The ashes were not only proof of what was gone, but of what could rise. They carried the memory of fire, but also the quiet promise of life carried forward, different and perhaps stronger. She rose, dusting her hands on her coat, some of the gray staying behind, as if to anchor her to both yesterday and tomorrow. Isn't it true that even in the places where we are most broken, a small, steady flame of hope can wait, patient and ready, for us to begin again? Days later, as neighbors returned to their routines and the traces of alarm faded from the street, she noticed the space that had formed. Quiet where noise had raged, stillness where urgency once lived. Yet beneath that calm, something remained, a silent bond tying her to the firefighters who had walked with her through the worst. She could not put it into words, but whenever she passed the spot where the truck had waited, she felt it. A presence, like footprints pressed lightly, but deeply into her path. They had stepped into her life for only a handful of minutes, but their calm voices and steady hands were now part of her memory, stitched into her own story. Even after they left, she found herself recalling their discipline, their care, and the way they trusted one another, without question. It was a lesson she hadn't expected, that true connection doesn't always need long conversations or shared history. Sometimes it is forged in the space between disaster and relief, brief but lasting, invisible but unbreakable. She began to notice the little ways their impact lingered. When she helped a neighbor sweep up fallen branches, or paused to listen to someone's worry, she felt a thread pulling gently between her and the memory of those who helped save her. The firefighters never returned, but the dignity and kindness they showed echoed in her daily choices, in patience offered, in compassion given, in every careful check of windows at dusk. Their work wasn't just about fighting fire, it was about teaching, through action, how even strangers can become anchors for one another. She often wondered if they knew the power of what they left behind, how their quiet assurance had shaped her, and how, even as strangers, they would always remain connected by a story only they truly shared. Isn't it remarkable how sometimes the strongest ties are invisible, the kind that stay with us, guiding our hearts, even after emergency gives way to the ordinary once more? With each passing day, she found herself returning to the memory of that sharp, desperate cry, "Not while I'm breathing." It amazed her how a single moment, so full of fear and urgency, could shine so bright in her memory, burning through all the shadows that followed. Before the fire, she might have doubted that one small act could tip the scales between surrender and hope. But now she understood. In speaking out, she had lit a spark deep inside, a pulse of willpower that reached far beyond the flames. That cry was more than sound. It was a promise to herself, a refusal to let darkness close in. In repeating those words, even only in memory, she kept the flame alive, proof that life and self-worth could grow strongest when tested. Looking back, she saw how everything that followed, the arrival of help, the gentle grip of a rescuer's hand, the way her lungs filled with fresh air, had been set in motion by the decision not to let go. The fire had threatened to take everything, but it was her voice, her fierce spark, that turned the tide. That certainty stayed with her, as real as the touch of sunlight through her window each morning. Whenever doubt crept in, she recalled the way her words had carried her to safety, and how they marked the start of a new chapter. Isn't it striking how sometimes, in a moment when we fear we have nothing left, a single cry of determination can light the path back to ourselves? One quiet evening, as she sat by the open window and let the hush of twilight settle around her, a distant sound drifted through the air, a siren rising and falling on the wind. It was not loud, just a faint echo carried from another part of town, but it called up memories that rested just beneath her skin. She paused, listening, feeling her heartbeat respond with a prick of recognition and respect. Somewhere, another set of lives would soon be touched by flame or flood or fear. Somewhere else, strangers would gather in the rush of emergency, trusting in the calm and courage of hands and hearts they might never see again. She closed her eyes, letting that thin wail link her to something larger, a web of stories, woven by need and answered by resolve. The siren didn't frighten her now. Instead, it sounded like a gentle reminder that life, with all its danger and longing, kept moving forward. She watched the sky darken, the world folding itself into fresh shadows and possibilities. That returning siren told her she was not standing still. Her own rescue was only one thread in a long tapestry still being made. The knowledge was both solemn and hopeful. Every day would bring new trials for someone, new calls for bravery and kindness, new occasions when a voice might rise up and change everything. The silence after the siren faded was deep and sweet, full of space for beginnings, healing, and quiet gratitude. She set her hand on the sill, steady and sure, a small smile flickering, as she turned back to the gentle mess of rebuilding her life. Don't we all carry echoes of old alarms, ready to listen or respond, each of us a chapter in the great, ongoing story of hope? She sat still for a long moment, letting the sounds of the evening settle and grow gentle around her. All that had happened, the edge between life and death, the terror and the calm, had left her changed in ways she hadn't expected. Looking back, she saw how courage had not arrived with any warning. It had crept in quietly, hidden beneath fear, waiting for the sharpest test before rising up inside her like a new pulse. When the moments grew darkest, at the thin line where breath and memory nearly broke, there had been no plan, no prepared answer, only a raw will to survive, to draw in one more lungful of air, to call out rather than be silent. In that space between despair and hope, something ancient and bright had flickered awake inside her. It was the kind of strength she might have doubted, in herself, in anyone, until life demanded it be revealed. Now, with the worst behind her but the memory still keen, she marveled at the urge to keep going, even as the world was stripped down to its simplest forms. Somehow, the meeting of life and death hadn't hollowed her, but had filled her with a fierce gentleness, a faith in her ability to endure, and in the lasting impact of a single defiant act. Each breath now seemed precious, each quiet moment proof that rising from hardship was not only possible, but natural. She understood, with a clarity earned by fire, that unexpected strength could carry her through any night, and that she was not alone. So many others waited at that same crossroads, discovering their own ability to stand when standing felt impossible. Is it not a wonder, she thought, that the best in us can arrive, just when we believe we have nothing left to give? That out of life's most dangerous hours, a lasting hope can be born? Long after the embers have faded and the steady hush of night has settled, a different set of questions may begin to surface. She finds herself wondering about the fine line between perseverance and surrender, the invisible place where fighting grows quiet and letting go starts to whisper. Is it exhaustion, fear, or simple acceptance that brings someone to turn away from the struggle? Maybe it's not just one thing, but a slow wearing down, a day when hope feels too far to reach, and the strength to call for help dries up. Yet even on those days, she remembers, a single emotion, a breath, a memory, a promise, can stop the drift towards silence. How many times, she wonders, do we unknowingly pause at those crossroads, uncertain whether to keep fighting or let the currents carry us away? What if the moment we yield is only a breath away from rescue, change, or a new beginning? But then, another question glimmers, softer but more urgent. When do we find a voice inside that rises up, unexpected, unmistakable, when we need it most? Is it born of habit, of lessons learned in loss or love, or a deep part of us that no hardship can erase? She has lived enough to know that sometimes courage is not a shout, but a whisper that refuses to go quiet. Sometimes it's a word remembered from childhood, or the echo of someone else's faith in us. What matters most, she thinks, is not always understanding where the impulse comes from, but trusting that it will come, often at the edge, in a moment when all seems lost. So she offers these questions to you. When do you feel yourself falter? And when has your own voice, strong, small, or silent, lifted you through the darkness and brought you back to hope? If this story touched your heart, share your thoughts or memories below. To keep these gentle stories close, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next moment of courage and belonging. If you found a piece of your own story in these quiet moments, a memory of struggle, a breath of unexpected courage, or a gentle reminder that you are never alone, I invite you to share your thoughts below. Stories grow stronger when they are told and heard, weaving unseen threads between people who may never meet but understand each other just the same. Every reflection, every word, helps light the way for someone else standing on the edge of hope. Your story, your question, or even your silent presence here can be a lifeline for another person who needs to know they are not the only one who has faced the dark and chosen to stand. If you wish to walk with us through more of these narratives, these letters of courage, kindness, and healing, please consider subscribing to the channel. Tap the notification bell so you won't miss the next time hope emerges from ordinary days and quiet bravery finds its voice. Each story is crafted to remind us what we already know deep down, that together, through simple acts and shared experience, we help keep the flame alive for each other. Thank you for joining this gentle circle tonight. May the next story find you with warmth, comfort, and a renewed spark to keep going.